Hello and welcome. Today I will be reading from My Antonia by Willa Cather. I've been working my way through the book here on the channel. Well, really almost since the channel began. I will have the links to previous videos. We're picking up with Book 2, The Hired Girl. I had been living with my grandfather for nearly 3 years when he decided to move to Blackhawk. He and grandmother were getting old for the heavy work of a farm, and as I was now 13, they thought I ought to be going to school. Accordingly, our homestead was rented to that good woman, the widow Stevens, and her bachelor brother, and we bought Preacher White's house at the north end of Blackhawk. This was the first town house one passed driving in from the farm, a landmark which told country people their long ride was over. We were to move to Blackhawk in March, and as soon as grandfather had fixed the date, he let Jake and Otto know of his intention. Otto said he would not be likely to find another place that suited him so well, that he was tired of farming and thought he would go back to what he called the Wild West. Jake Marple, lured by Otto's stories of adventure, decided to go with him. We did our best to dissuade Jake. He was so handicapped by illiteracy and by his trusting disposition that he would be an easy prey to sharpers. Grandmother begged him to stay among kindly Christian people where he was known, but there was no reasoning with him. He wanted to be a prospector. He thought a silver mine was waiting for him in Colorado. Jake and Otto served us to the last. They moved us into town, put down the carpets in our new house, made shelves and cupboards for grandmother's kitchen, and seemed loath to leave us. But at last they went, without warning. Those two fellows had been faithful to us through sun and storm, had given us things that cannot be bought in any market in the world. With me they had been like older brothers, had restrained their speech and manners out of care for me, and given me so much good comradeship. Now they got on the westbound train one morning, in their Sunday clothes with their oilcloth valises, and I never saw them again. Months afterward, we got a card from Otto, saying that Jake had been down with mountain fever, but now they were both working in the Yankee Girl mine and were doing well. I wrote to them at that address, but my letter was returned to me unclaimed. After that, we never heard from them. Blackhawk, the new world in which we had come to live, was a clean, well-planted little prairie town, with white fences and good green yards about the dwellings, wide dusty streets, and shapely little trees growing along the wooden sidewalks. In the center of town there were 2 rows of new brick store buildings, a brick schoolhouse, the courthouse, and 4 white churches. Our own house looked down over the town, and from our upstairs windows we could see the winding line of the river bluffs 2 miles south of us. That river was to be my compensation for the lost freedom of the farming country. We came to Blackhawk in March, and by the end of April we felt like town people. Grandfather was a deacon in the new Baptist church. Grandmother was busy with church suppers and missionary societies, and I was quite another boy, or thought I was. Suddenly put down among boys of my own age, I found I had a great deal to learn. Before the spring term of school was over, I could fight, play keeps, tease the little girls, and use forbidden words as well as any boy in my class. I was restrained from utter savagery only by the fact that Mrs. Harling, our nearest neighbor, kept an eye on me, and if my behavior went beyond certain bounds, I was not permitted to come into her yard or to play with her jolly children. We saw more of our country neighbors now than when we lived on the farm. Our house was a convenient stopping place for them. We had a big barn where the farmers could put up their teams, and their womenfolk more often accompanied them, now that they could stay with us for dinner and rest and set their bonnets right before they went shopping. The more our house was like a country hotel, the better I liked it. I was glad, when I came home from school at noon, to see a farm wagon standing in the backyard, and I was always ready to run downtown to get beefsteak or baker's bread for unexpected company. All through that first spring and summer, I kept hoping that Ambrose would bring Antonia and Yulka to see our new house. I wanted to show them our red plush furniture and the trumpet-blowing cherubs the German paper hanger had put on our parlor ceiling. When Ambrose came to town, however, he came alone, and though he put his horses in our barn, he would never stay for dinner or tell us anything about his mother and sisters. If we ran out and questioned him as he was slipping through the yard, he would merely work his shoulders about in his coat and say, "They all right, I guess." Mrs. Stevens, who now lived on our farm, grew as fond of Antonia as we had been, and always brought us news of her. All through the wheat season, she told us, Ambrose hired his sister out like a man, and she went from farm to farm, binding sheaves or working with threshers. The farmers liked her and were kind to her, said they would rather have her for a hand than Ambrose. When fall came, she was to husk corn for the neighbors until Christmas, as she had done the year before. But grandmother saved her from this by getting her a place to work with our neighbors, the Harlings. Chapter 2. Grandmother often said that if she had to live in town, she thanked God she lived next the Harlings. They had been farming people, like ourselves, and their place was like a little farm, with a big barn and a garden and an orchard and grazing lots, even a windmill. The Harlings were Norwegians, and Mrs. Harling had lived in Christiania until she was 10 years old. Her husband was born in Minnesota. He was a grain merchant and cattle buyer, and was generally considered the most enterprising businessman in our county. He controlled a line of grain elevators in the little towns along the railroad to the west of us, and was away from home a great deal. In his absence, his wife was the head of the household. Mrs. Harling was short and square and sturdy-looking, like her house. Every inch of her was charged with energy that made itself felt the moment she entered a room. Her face was rosy and solid, with bright, twinkling eyes and a stubborn little chin. She was quick to anger, quick to laughter, and jolly from the depths of her soul. How well I remember her laugh. It had in it the same sudden recognition that flashed into her eyes, was a burst of humor, short and intelligent. Her rapid footsteps shook her own floors, and she routed lassitude and indifference wherever she came. She could not be negative or perfunctory about anything. Her enthusiasm and her violent likes and dislikes asserted themselves in all the everyday occupations of life. Wash day was interesting, never dreary at the Harlings. Preserving time was a prolonged festival, and house cleaning was like a revolution. When Mrs. Harling made garden that spring, we could feel the stir of her undertaking through the willow hedge that separated our place from hers. 3 of the Harling children were near me in age. Charlie, the only son, they had lost an older boy, was 16. Julia, who was known as the musical one, was 14 when I was. And Sally, the tomboy with short hair, was a year younger. She was nearly as strong as I and uncannily clever at all boy sports. Sally was a wild thing, with sunburned yellow hair bobbed about her ears and a brown skin, for she never wore a hat. She raced all over town on one roller skate, often cheated at keeps, but was such a quick shot one couldn't catch her at it. The grown-up daughter, Frances, was a very important person in our world. She was her father's chief clerk and virtually managed his Black Hawk office during his frequent absences. Because of her unusual business ability, he was stern and exacting with her. He paid her a good salary, but she had few holidays and never got away from her responsibilities. Even on Sundays, she went to the office to open the mail and read the markets. With Charlie, who was not interested in business, but was already preparing for Annapolis, Mr. Harling was very indulgent, bought him guns and tools and electric batteries, and never asked what he did with them. Frances was dark, like her father, and quite as tall. In winter, she wore a seal-skin coat and cap, and she and Mr. Harling used to walk home together in the evening, talking about grain cars and cattle like 2 men. Sometimes she came over to see grandfather after supper, and her visits flattered him. More than once they put their wits together to rescue some unfortunate farmer from the clutches of Wick Cutter, the Black Hawk moneylender. Grandfather said Frances Harling was as good a judge of credits as any banker in the county. The 2 or 3 men who had tried to take advantage of her in a deal acquired celebrity by their defeat. She knew every farmer for miles about, how much land he had under cultivation, how many cattle he was feeding, what his liabilities were. Her interest in these people was more than a business interest. She carried them all in her mind as if they were characters in a book or play. When Frances drove out into the country on business, she would go miles out of her way to call on some of the old people, or to see the women who seldom got to town. She was quick at understanding the grandmothers who spoke no English, and the most reticent and distrustful of them would tell her their story without realizing they were doing so. She went to country funerals and weddings in all weathers. A farmer's daughter who was to be married could count on a wedding present from Frances Harling. In August, the Harlings' Danish cook had to leave them. Grandmother entreated them to try Antonia. She cornered Ambrose the next time he came to town, and pointed out to him that any connection with Christian Harling would strengthen his credit and be of advantage to him. One Sunday, Mrs. Harling took the long ride out to the Shimerdas with Frances. She said she wanted to see what the girl came from, and have a clear understanding with her mother. I was in our yard when they came driving home just before sunset. They laughed and waved to me as they passed, and I could see they were in great good humor. After supper, when grandfather set off to church, grandmother and I took my shortcut through the willow hedge and went over to hear about the visit to the Shimerdas. We found Mrs. Harling with Charlie and Sally on the front porch, resting after her hard drive. Julia was in the hammock. She was fond of repose. And Frances was at the piano, playing without a light and talking to her mother through the open window. Mrs. Harling laughed when she saw us coming. "I expect you left your dishes on the table tonight, Mrs. Burden," she called. Frances shut the piano and came out to join us. They had liked Antonia from their first glimpse of her, felt they knew exactly what kind of girl she was. As for Mrs. Shimerda, they found her very amusing. Mrs. Harling chuckled whenever she spoke of her. I expect I am more at home with that sort of bird than you are, Mrs. Burden. They're a pair, Ambrose and that old woman. They had a long argument with Ambrose about Antonia's allowance for clothes and pocket money. It was his plan that every cent of his sister's wages should be paid over to him each month, and he would provide her with such clothing as he thought necessary. When Mrs. Harling told him firmly that she would keep $50 a year for Antonia's own use, he declared they wanted to take his sister to town and dress her up and make a fool of her. Mrs. Harling gave us a lively account of Ambrose's behavior throughout the interview. How he kept jumping up and putting on his cap as if he were through with the whole business, and how his mother tweaked his coat tail and prompted him in Bohemian. Mrs. Harling finally agreed to pay $3 a week for Antonia's services, good wages in those days, and to keep her in shoes. There had been hot dispute about the shoes, Mrs. Shimerda finally saying persuasively that she would send Mrs. Harling 3 fat geese every year to make even. Ambrose was to bring his sister to town next Saturday. She'll be awkward and rough at first, like enough, Grandmother said anxiously. But unless she's been spoiled by the hard life she's led, she has it in her to be a real helpful girl. Mrs. Harling laughed her quick, decided laugh. Oh, I'm not worrying, Mrs. Burden. I can bring something out of that girl. She's barely 17, not too old to learn new ways. She's good-looking, too, she added warmly. Frances turned to Grandmother. Oh, yes, Mrs. Burden, you didn't tell us that. She was working in the garden when we got there, barefoot and ragged. But she has such fine brown legs and arms and splendid color in her cheeks, like those big, dark, red plums. We were pleased at this praise. Grandmother spoke feelingly. When she first came to this country, Frances, and had that genteel old man to watch over her, she was as pretty a girl as I ever saw. But dear me, what a life she's led out in the fields with those rough threshers. Things would have been very different with poor Antonia if her father had lived. The Harlings begged us to tell them about Mr. Shimerda's death and the big snowstorm. By the time we saw Grandfather coming home from church, we had told them pretty much all we knew of the Shimerdas. The girl will be happy here, and she'll forget about those things, said Mrs. Harling confidently, as we rose to take our leave. I hope you've enjoyed that, and we'll tune in for the next chapter when we get there. Have a wonderful